Tansei, good afternoon. I'm Matei. Welcome to APTN National News. Cassidy Caron, the president of the Métis National Council, is speaking out regarding both the Manitoba Métis Federation and Métis Nation Saskatchewan withdrawing from the MNC. In a statement, Caron notes the successes she has helped build in her 3-year term, including rebuilding the MNC to be more transparent, accountable, and ethical, and promises the work will continue with the federal government to find solutions to the unique and ongoing challenges faced by Métis citizens. Despite this work and numerous reforms, she says the MNC is now at a crossroads, saying individual Métis governments like the Manitoba Métis Federation and more recently Métis Nation Saskatchewan are choosing to work independently. And she says while it's their right and respects their decision, she also believes there is more strength through unity and standing together as one Métis nation. In her statement, she zeroes in on the current leadership, adding, "I believe that some leaders have forgotten about our greater responsibility to each other and to nationhood. The unity we are striving for is being divided by the self-interest, impatient, and ambitions of a few, rather than the collective aspirations or values of our people. The need for a strong national voice, collaborative engagement, and respectful dialogue between all Métis has not and will not change." Caron says she has proposed a way forward for the MNC since Métis Nation Saskatchewan left the MNC last Friday, and it will be up to the council members to determine the next steps. Caron has 1 more week left in her term as president. Meanwhile, the Chiefs of Ontario is publicly congratulating Métis Nation Saskatchewan on its decision to leave the Métis National Council and distance themselves from the Métis Nation of Ontario. They hope it will send a clear message to the federal government that the proposed Bill C-53 needs to be scrapped. If passed, Bill C-53 would recognize the MNO as a legitimate Section 35 rights-bearing nation. In a statement, Ontario Regional Chief Abram Benedict said that Métis Nation of Ontario's claims have not stood up to scrutiny, and they are now seeing the repercussions, adding that, quote, "The MNO is a group who has been getting away with making unfounded claims in First Nations, ancestral and treaty territories in Ontario for far too long." The Chiefs of Ontario say this is why both the Manitoba Métis Federation and the MNS has left, because the MNO continues to have a seat at the MNC table. Chief Benedict added, "It is a shame that the MNC continues to prop up the MNO despite 2 of its governing members withdrawing their membership as a result. The MNC was ordered by the court to take a position on whether the so-called MNO communities in Ontario are part of the historic Métis Nation, and was directed to conduct an internal review of the MNO communities. That was supposed to be completed in August, with the deadline now having been extended to October. We continue to wait for the release of this review and for the MNC to finally take a position on the MNO." And that brings us to today's website poll question. How important do you think unity among Métis governments is for advancing Métis rights? We have some questions, some answers here. Very important, somewhat, important, not important, or unsure. Go to www.aptnnews.ca to have your say. Those flying from Winnipeg to Manitoba Cree Nation in northern Manitoba will be greeted with a new sign at the Perimeter Aviation Terminal before they depart. Passengers will be reminded that they and their belongings may be searched after landing in an effort to stop the smuggling of drugs and alcohol into the designated dry reserve. A QR code on the sign directs passengers to Manitoba intoxicants bylaw. In July, Manitoba Cree Nation entered an agreement with the Manitoba Minister of Justice that allows their First Nation safety officers to enforce the ban at God's River Airport and other access points. Those caught transporting alcohol could be fined $2,500 under the Liquor, Gaming and Cannabis Control Act. The enforcement hopes to create a sense of safety and security in the community after a young mother died last year.
It's a testament for our community, for our leadership, that, you know, the safety is paramount for our community. We have lost lives that could have been prevented. And that's one of the things that, you know, our primary motivation in getting all that the drugs and the alcohol not to be smuggled in, and we want to be able to tackle these drug traffickers in our community and the bootleggers. And most of all, the healing will begin for our community.
There's another candidate in the race for chief of the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations in Saskatchewan. Third Vice Chief Ali Bear has announced her intent to unseat incumbent Bobby Cameron at this fall's election. Video journalist Rachel May has more.
I announce my candidacy today, September 23rd, 2024, to run for the Chief of the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations.
At Dakota Dunes on the Whitecap Dakota Nation, Ali Bear launched her campaign for chief to a room filled with supporters. Chief Matthew Pegan of the Pasqua First Nation not only supports Bear, but nominated her for this election. He says the FSIN needs new blood, and Bear has the passion and drive for long overdue changes.
Miss Bear's compassion, her energy, you've observed that. And I've observed a number of people, and in her leadership role as a vice chief, she doesn't set the tone, but as chief, you can set the tone. And with her passion and her energy, I believe that tone that she will set with her vice chiefs, would be a benefit to all the First Nations within the FSIN.
Dorothea Swift-Wolf, a missing persons liaison with the Saskatoon Police Service, is not a chief and doesn't have a vote, but she supports Bear.
If you've never been in a court at all and you don't understand the language that's used or why things are done this way, Ali was able to explain to our families, work with the families, and support our families.
Bear hopes to keep working with the RCMP to build Indigenous policing.
I've also, worked very closely with the RCMP, with High Commissioner Rhonda Blackmore. We signed a memorandum of agreement together to enhance communications and to have a better oversight process into investigations.
When asked about current FSIN Chief Bobby Cameron's eligibility for the upcoming election, she said transparency is very important.
We need to abide by our own traditional protocols and values, and one of that's honesty and truth. And so I think that with honesty and truth, we can regain trust, and that's really important.
Regarding the FSIN audit, she has no information yet, but is expecting an update soon. Rachel May, APTN National News, Saskatoon.
A long-serving Indigenous leader and advocate is being recognized for his contributions to cultural awareness. Dean Sayers served as Chief of Batchewana First Nation for 20 years and once ran for National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. Recently, he received a Municipal Heritage Award from the City of Sault Ste. Marie. APTN's Mike Donald reports.
It was in front of a predominantly non-Indigenous audience that former Batchewana Chief Dean Sayers received his award. It's a position he frequently finds himself in.
Organizations, the groups that I speak to now are mainstream Canadian people that are hungry for the perspective that might come from one of the Indigenous people in the area. I find there is quite the embrace of the perspective and the insights that are brought by an Indigenous person as opposed to somebody that talks about Native people.
The award recognizes contributions to Sault Ste. Marie's cultural heritage. Sayers was instrumental in the creation and development of the Voices from the Gathering Place project, which serves as a historical resource for the Sault Ste. Marie region. Sayers says there was once a time when being recognized by a non-Indigenous entity for Indigenous cultural contributions was unheard of.
It wasn't that long ago when we weren't allowed to talk about who we were. We weren't allowed to speak our language. We weren't allowed to do our ceremonies. We weren't allowed to leave our communities. Things have evolved in the last couple of generations where we have a lot of freedoms. But with that freedom, there's also the freedom of expression, the freedom of our history, the freedom of our perspective.
Sayers says the award comes in the spirit of reconciliation, and he hopes it plants the seeds to allow Indigenous people to reclaim our rightful place in society. Mike McDonald, APTN National News, Sault Ste. Marie.
Thank you, Mike. A new report is painting a clearer picture on the current salmon stock in BC and the Yukon. And there is a new Indigenous choreographed ballet show making its big debut in New York City. Those stories when we come back. Stay with us. Welcome back. A new ballet choreographed by APTN Nation member Caron Fraser Monroe will debut in New York City next week. Titled Shegatam, it tells the story of APTN elder who learns to lean on his community in a time of need. APTN Sarah Bentons chats with Fraser Monroe about the ballet and brings you a sneak peek from rehearsals.
We're here behind the scenes at the Royal Winnipeg Ballet, where dancers are busy rehearsing Caron Fraser Monroe's new work, Shegatam, which is premiering in New York City. And today we have the pleasure of being joined by Caron, who's a member of the Tla'amin First Nation in British Columbia. Caron, would you mind just telling us a bit about the story behind this ballet?
Absolutely. So when I received this commission, I thought that the most important thing I could talk about in the moment was the way my elders in Tla'amin have a great resilience and strength behind them. There are 94-year-olds like Elder Elsie Paul who is still trying to chop her own firewood and is still very mobile. And I think that the reason behind this is that she has a wonderful community supporting her, and she's able to ask for help with the small tasks. So that's kind of what the work is about, is a dancer learning how to ask for help from his community.
Yeah, and I know this work is a partnership between, the RWB, the New York City Center, and the Bard Center for Indigenous Studies. I'm curious to know how this opportunity come about in the first place.
Yes, absolutely. And so it has come together very quickly. Normally commissions take years and years of planning, but New York City Center hosts Fall for Dance Festival every year, and they bring in some wonderful companies. And they reached out to the RWB to commission me to create a new work in partnership with the Bard Center for Indigenous Studies. So part of the event is a lecture and demonstration at Bard College, as well as a talkback in New York City. And we're taking this work down to premiere on September 26th. So it's very exciting.
Yeah, and so I know the meaning of Shegatam is to lift someone. I was curious to know, how do you kind of convey that through movement in this ballet?
Yes, it's to lift someone up, and it starts quite literally with someone standing on the shoulders of his community, and then he falls from his kind of peak of leadership and has to relearn how he negotiates those relationships and how he relates to the people around him. So, of course, there's a lot of physical lifting, but it's also very much about the way we lift up our elders and support those people, because they're not superhumans, they're people just like us as well.
Yeah, and I know the score for this ballet is composed by Jeremy Dutcher. I was curious to know, how did you work with him to convey this narrative through both movement and music?
That's right, and I'm super excited because Jeremy Dutcher's album just won the Polaris Prize, and he's the only individual in that awards history to have won it twice.
Jeremy Dutcher!
It's very exciting that we're taking that music to premiere this ballet in New York. So I didn't collaborate with him directly, but I did draw a lot of inspiration from that beautiful music, from that beautiful score, in order to tell this story. And in this case, the music actually came first. I heard that music and I knew I was going to have to choreograph to it, and I was saving it for the right opportunity, and I didn't have to wait long because this came up. And I'm, yeah, as I said, really excited to take Jeremy's work to Fall for Dance.
Mm-hmm. And I know you also have a background in grass and hoop dancing, and I'm curious to know, how do you incorporate those styles into your work?
Yeah, so like all artists, I'm influenced by my background and my upbringing, and for me that included Ukrainian dance and grass dance and hoop dance, as well as Coast Salish styles of dance. And then when I was 15, I moved here to the Royal Winnipeg Ballet, did my ballet training, worked as a contemporary dancer as well, and so I braid all of those influences into one movement vocabulary, and you see all of those influences present in the work.
Yeah, so you have less than a week till you and the dancers are all headed to New York City, but I'm curious to know, with this premiere, what do you want people to learn from this work and take away from this ballet?
Yeah, well, I'm honored that we have this opportunity to share this art on the world stage. I think that it's a huge opportunity to share other Indigenous artists as well as myself. So we mentioned Jeremy Dutcher, but we also have lighting design from Andy Monroe. So I just hope that we will be present on this world stage with companies like the Dutch National Ballet, Boston Ballet, of course, New York City Ballet, and to show them the excellence that all of our artists are cultivating in our own communities, and maybe to have an opportunity to share that in a wider form. So yeah, that's what I'm hoping they'll take away from it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for talking with us, Cameron. And yeah, best of luck in New York. And back to you in studio.
Thanks, Sarah. The salmon in BC and the Yukon is seeing a widespread decline. We'll speak to an expert on this topic when we come back in less than 3 minutes. Stay with us. Over on the East Coast, St. John's 11, Charlottetown 16. Cartwright 11, the Grand River 11 as well. Gaspé 15, Val-d'Or 13. Windsor 17, Peterborough 16. 24 in Timmins, 13 in Sioux Lookout. God's Lake 13, Thompson 10. Winnipeg 16, Barons River 17. 14 in Regina, Saskatoon 14. Stony Rapids 2, Buffalo Narrows 14. 20 in Peace River, Fort Chipewyan 18. 27 in Calgary, Red Deer 28. Tofino 16, Kamloops 28. Sandspit 15, Smithers 13. Beaver Creek 10, Mayo 10 as well. 12 in Yellowknife, Wati 9. Sax Harbor 5, Colville Lake 5 as well. Baker Lake 7, Chesterfield 8. And Arctic Bay 8, and Igloolik 4. A new report by the Pacific Salmon Foundation is reporting widespread decline of salmon in British Columbia and the Yukon. The State of Salmon report is the first of its kind to assess Pacific salmon and steelhead species across 9 regions in Canada. It found more than 70% of salmon are below their long-term average. Here to talk about the report is Katrina Connors, Senior Director of Pacific Salmon Foundation. Thanks so much for joining us today, Katrina. Can you walk us through the report's main findings?
Yeah, so overall, we found that there was fairly widespread declines in salmon abundance across all 6 species of Pacific salmon and in all 9 major salmon-bearing regions in Western Canada. And we found that out of the 41 different combinations of species and regions, more than 70% of them were below their long-term average abundance. So that was the main finding. And within that, we also found that 2 species, in particular chum and steelhead, were doing the worst, with abundances below the long-term average in every single region we looked at. In addition to that, we also found that northern regions within Western Canada had the most widespread declines. And this is something that was concerning for us, given that northern regions are warming faster than the rest of Canada. But we did find some hope. We do see some encouraging signs of recovery, and we point out some of those examples within our report.
Yeah, like you said, the report states the northernmost regions of BC and the Yukon are warming faster than the rest of Canada. What impact does that have on salmon?
Yeah, it certainly is having impacts on freshwater environments and marine environments as well. On the freshwater side, with a rapidly warming climate, we're starting to see stream temperatures increase and testing salmon. So salmon can only survive in freshwater up to a certain upper limit. And in many years, in many places in northern regions, we're starting to see that thermal limit be exceeded. In addition to that, we have persistent drought in some regions that are leading to low flows, and these are leading to challenges for salmon survival, causing more stress, leading to more pre-spawn mortality. And then in the marine environment, we're seeing warming of the ocean, and this is having a number of ecosystem level effects, including providing less nutritious food that salmon in northern regions like to predate on. You're seeing less nutritious food brought about in part by a warming ocean. And then you're also seeing kind of more competition for a finite amount of habitat. There's more salmon. It might be surprising to hear there's more salmon in the ocean than there have been over the past 100 years. But more salmon means more mouths to feed. And then, as I said, less nutritious food. And so it's creating heightened competition that is adversely affecting salmon survival.
What action do you think needs to be taken, and by who, to protect the salmon?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of things that we can do. I think, first and foremost, I think we can preserve and protect the salmon habitats that are intact and high functioning. And these same habitats tend to be refuges for salmon. They are more productive. You've got lots of genetic diversity. So protecting those habitats that we know are intact is a key strategy. And in particular, when we're thinking about those habitats, we can be more forward-looking. We can ask ourselves which of these habitats are likely to be more resilient to a rapidly changing climate. As an example of that, some habitats have natural climate refuges. They'll have places of cold water upwelling, and protecting habitats that have those climate refuges are going to help salmon adapt in a changing environment. I think that's one key part. Another key part is just minimizing the impacts fisheries have on at-risk populations. And there's good examples of how that can be done by having more selective fisheries. For example, in the Nass, the Nisga'a First Nation, they operate a fish wheel where they have a fairly intensive monitoring program in place to count returning salmon. They know which populations, which species, and how many are coming back real time in season. And they use that information to inform their fisheries to make sure that they're minimizing impacts to at-risk populations and are harvesting those that are more abundant. And that's kind of an example, but it's a key strategy that we can employ in order to have more sustainable fishing opportunities. The last piece I would just say is also addressing some pretty critical data gaps that we found. So a key part to protecting and preserving wild salmon is understanding how they're doing. And we couldn't do that everywhere. There were some areas and for some species where there wasn't enough information that we're collecting that we really just don't know how salmon are doing. And so knowing when and how to intervene is a problem if you don't know where you're starting from.
Yeah, and like you said, Katrina, the report also found there were signs of hope when it comes to the salmon. Can you tell us any more about that?
Yeah, so some great examples of hope would be in the southern parts of BC. One example that we highlight in our report is Fraser coho. And as you might know, Fraser coho actually crashed in about the mid-1990s. They were highly abundant in the early 80s, but then they declined by over 60%. And at the time, there was some pretty stark measures put in place, including an almost complete ban on fisheries. Yeah. And that's been in place for a couple decades. And it's only in recent years that we're starting to see coho numbers come back above their long-term average. And so this really provides hope that we can put measures in place, that we can see signs of recovery if we, limit human actions, put fishery bans in place, but also invest in salmon recovery, which is also a key aspect of the recovery here.
Well, we'll have to leave it there, Katrina. Thank you for your time for talking about this important report.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That's your midday newscast for this Tuesday, September 24th. Dennis Ward will be here in a few hours for your evening newscast. Make sure to join us then. From everyone at APTN National News, thank you for watching. And again, we'll see you tomorrow. Exe.